And thanks, Catherine, for the introduction to Reeler. It saves me saying a lot about our fieldwork. My name's Jessica, and I'm a research assistant here at the University of Aarhus. And I've been with the Reeler project for the past 3 years, since its beginning. And today I'll be presenting my work, a lot of other researchers' work, including Carolina's. A great deal of it was Carolina's. And you'll see some videos from her because of her pregnancy. And you'll also see some photos and videos, most of which were made by Kate, our photographer, who's running around right now in the room. So Carolina and I, along with a team of researchers, conducted ethnographic fieldwork for our 11 case studies. And today we'll discuss the reasons and grounding for ethnographic research, our methods of investigation and analysis, and the challenges we faced and the contributions that we think ethnography can make to robotics. Yes. So I'll start with this Mentimeter question. If you could just take 3 minutes to look at the images of the workers and reflect on their work by answering the question, which words do you associate with the work of this cleaning worker and these construction workers? So you can put up to 5 words in the Mentimeter question. And in the meantime, I'll continue my presentation. So, yeah. So Carolina and I would like to ask, why ethnography? What does it bring to robotics that other methods and methodologies don't? Ethnography is chiefly the study of people, and social scientists can mostly agree that robots aren't people. But robots are embedded in a world filled with people, and they're made by people, they're dreamt up by people, they're thought about by people in movies and TV, and they might replace some people. So in the end, robotics really is a field about people. So there's nothing more suited for the study of robotics than ethnography, which can help us understand the complexity and collaborative culture of robotics. Carolina will give her input on why ethnography.
So why ethnography to study ethics in robotics? Ethnography in general, it's a very good approach to engage with people. If you want to study people and in the natural environments, in the everyday environments, if you want to study everyday practices and experiences, then it's a very good idea to use ethnographic methods. And that's what we did in the Reeler project.
Yeah.
Click away from the commercial. So this is us testing.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know what you mean, click away.
Just make it small.
No.
I think we have to escape.
Yeah. Okay.
There we are. Okay,
Got
so escape.
So Reeler's a unique project. In 2016, there were 17 Horizon 2020 projects granted funding for robotics research, and Reeler was one of them. And it was the only social sciences and humanities-driven project of all of those robotics projects. So it's very unusual. And so from the beginning, we were positioned a little bit as outsiders in the European robotics community. And I think even more so because we have a grounded theory methodology, which is a little unlike the scientific method. So both scientific method and grounded theory begin with an open question, but the difference is that the scientific method uses experimentation and deductive reasoning to develop new theories, whereas grounded theory is an inductive process. So rather than forming a theoretical hypothesis and confirming or rejecting it, grounded theory emerges from data collection. So we start with an open question, an open question, and through our data collection, we identify patterns or empirical findings. And then we categorize these patterns, sometimes, as we did, through a process of coding, and that produces some analytical findings, which we then mull over to produce new theory. So ethnographic studies are a part of grounded theory, but ethnography is typically focused on one case. It's a very close-up study, and it's usually over a long period of time, which means that it can take a long time before analytical patterns and theories are cultivated. So due to the constraints of our project being only 36 months, we came up with a creative way to amplify the grounded theory process while staying within ethnographic tradition. And that's the multivariation approach that Catherine mentioned. So the multi-part refers to our cross-case analysis. We had these 11 cases, and we did a reeling process of fieldwork and analysis. And the variation comes in our case selection. We started by choosing cases that were very different in the type of robot, the sector where they're applied, and the geography where they're located, and also the organization type. Are they university projects or big public projects, or are they private developments? And the point was that in the end, instead of looking in one case as you would in ethnography, we could look across to try to find these patterns and develop these analytical categories and develop new theory, which is how we landed with our human proximity model and other findings. So we used ethnographic methods as our main source for these case studies, and from that we used qualitative interviews combined with this provocation method of visual elicitation, where we showed a video of real robots in practice and performing the tasks that they perform to our participants. And we took field notes from all these encounters, and we also looked at their websites and other documents, and all of this went into what we called case write-ups. So each case, which may study one or more robots, was written up into a case write-up, and we analyzed those as well as the transcripts from our qualitative interviews. But I think the best way is to tell you a little bit about some of the cases that we did. So one of my favorite cases is the cleaning and disinfecting robots. These types of robots are used in hospitals or hotels to clean, and this case was built bottom up. So we started with the affected stakeholders, the people that are working with the robots or affected with the robots. We had two different stakeholder groups for this this case, cleaning workers in Portugal who cleaned hotels and vacation homes, and cleaning workers in Denmark who cleaned hospitals. And the two stakeholder groups had very different experiences of work. In Portugal, these women, and they were all women, worked very hard for very little money. They worked as a team with a male supervisor driving them around the villages in a van, where they would haul their equipment up very narrow steps to the vacation homes. And each of these vacation homes was different from the last. So this work was very different from hospital work, where rooms are intentionally set up to be very, very similar. But these women, a lot of them had very little education, and they felt stuck in their work. They complained of pain in their backs and knees from changing the sheets on the beds, and they wished for a device that could help them clear the cobwebs from the corners of the rooms. And many of them had hoped to take up other occupations, like becoming teachers or car mechanics, but their life circumstances prevented them from continuing their education or seeking other work. In contrast, the Danish cleaning women, and all of them were also women, these hospital cleaners and their manager, who also began as a cleaner, they never talked about relief. They never talked about their work being arduous or difficult. But instead, they talked about how much they enjoyed their work. They talked about the physical aspects. They couldn't imagine a robot doing a lot of the cleaning work they did, like disinfecting the crevices around the toilets or under their beds, but they would enjoy a tool that could help them in their work. They were already very used to using advanced cleaning technologies. They told us about special cloths and chemicals that they used, and also about floor washing machines, but they didn't get any respect from the wider community for their use of these advanced technologies. So they were very interested in taking up robots because they thought it would bring more respect to their field. Their main concerns with any robotization of their labor was that it might affect their relationships with their colleagues, that they might spend less time talking about, what's bothering them at home or how their vacation was, and that it might affect their relationship with patients. Even though they were cleaners, they were often the first person that the patients saw when they woke up. They would offer them a glass of water, or they would ask them how they were feeling. So this was very important to them. Care was a very big part of the cleaning work in the Danish hospitals. So similarly, in our construction robot case, we saw regional and age differences in experiences of work. The young men, and they were all men, and the migrant laborers were generally not opposed to wearing out their bodies as long as their pay was good. Some of them even had what one stakeholder called Tarzan syndrome, and this was an eagerness to perform feats of strength. What they were opposed to was utilizing any tool that might slow them down or disrupt their teamwork, or deprive them of ownership over the products of their labor. And by this I mean both their wages. A lot of them were paid on a piece rate, which means the more they work, the more they get paid. And also about ownership over the tangible outcome of their work. And so that is, how well they performed their work. What does it look like in the end? And if they're using an assistive device, some of them felt distanced from their work and didn't get the same sense of pride from a job well done. So our fieldwork took us to hospitals and construction sites, hotels, other workplaces, and robotics labs, where we became very familiar with different types of stakeholders in their work, including roboticists in their work. And we conducted qualitative interviews there using a predefined guide, which can also be found on the website that Catherine will talk about later. We conducted interviews in many languages: English, Danish, Polish, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and sometimes with the help of translators. And a typical ethnographic interview question, for those of you who are not anthropologists, is this day in the life question. So in Reeler, we ask this in this way: could you describe a typical day in your life or in your work life? For example, what did you do yesterday? And then our participants would take us through their work. They would start with, what they did when they first got to work, or maybe what they had for breakfast. And sometimes they would literally take us through their work, showing us where and how they perform their work. So this kind of close-up, intimate research is very hard to do. And it's very hard to do on the scale that we did it, with these different case studies and trying to find variation in all of them. And it was not without challenges, which Carolina will tell us here on the screen.
So, were there any challenges during our field work? Of course there were. So what were the main challenges for us? I could say that one of the main challenges was the study of ethics itself. It's not that easy to go and find out what ethics is for people and morality. What are their concerns? What are their ethical concerns related to robotics technologies, or simply what are their views? It's difficult, first of all, because ethics is a very broad term, and especially for people who do not have background in philosophy or the humanities, social sciences, or in social sciences, the term ethics can be quite confusing, and we got this type of reaction quite often, especially from the engineers, that when you say ethics, they say, oh, this is philosophical questions, you should ask philosophers, not me. So in order to deal with this challenge, we needed to adjust our language to meet our participants' preferences and to let them understand what do we mean by that. So, for example, rather than ask directly what do you mean by ethics, we could ask what do you mean by good and bad in the context of robotics, the robot design and the robot use. There is no one approach that would work for everyone, so we needed to adjust our language and our interviews for each and every participant separately, of course, while maintaining the core of our interview scenarios. So
Carolina talks about building a common language, and that's something that anthropologists tend to be very good at. It's part of something that we discuss in the handbook, or in the Perspectives on Robots book, about cultural brokerage. And she talks about good and bad, but we also talk about user needs and user requirements and these other terms that engineers are more familiar with. And then we try to open it up and get them to expand their notion of user needs a little bit. And on the user side, we talk to them about what matters in their work. And but ethics is something that we studied indirectly by asking a lot of questions around the meaning of work and what people value. So another issue was access, and I'll let Carolina explain again, but then I will elaborate a little bit on what she says here.
So from the research and business point of view, it was important to make sure that all the data we gather, all the responses and the concerns we identify, they would not let anyone to identify our participants, who the participants were. And that's a challenge from a methodological point of view, because how do you discuss the data if you need to fully anonymize them? Again, we took a creative approach towards that challenge, and we did find a way to, on the one hand, anonymize the data, on the other hand, to discuss our results in a way that can actually portray the situation and the concerns we found in the field and in the wild.
Yeah. So, it's doing it again. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so she talks about access, and so we had two very different issues with access. One was when studying with the robot makers, and that issue was usually that a lot of what they do is very confidential or protected. So we had a lot of the times to sign non-disclosure agreements, and if not that, or on top of that, we had to anonymize most of our data, as she mentions. And so that was one issue, was being able to talk about the research that we do and being able to actually get close to it. But on the other side, we had a big issue with studying affected stakeholders and workers, everyday workers, because a lot of them don't have the autonomy in their work or the agency to decide that they'll be a part of this study. And a lot of them had to first ask their supervisor. And if you're going to talk to people about decisions made on the managerial level about automation or robotization, a lot of the times they don't really want you to talk to their workers about that because they can get quite scared about replacement. But actually one of the things we found was that even if people didn't face replacement, there were a lot of other issues about work and how it was transformed by robotization. So, still not. Oh, there we go. So what kind of data did we produce? We, in the end, recorded over 177 interviews. 139 of these followed our interview guide, and those were put into in vivo qualitative data analysis software. And one of the challenges we often face working in this interdisciplinary field between robotics and anthropology is that our methodology is questioned as being not scientific or invalid. And that's because it is a strange thing for people in the hard sciences to see us start with data and then sort of weave our way through it and eventually come up with theory, rather than testing something that you can repeat over and over again. But one of the ways that we manage this challenge is to use this software. So each interview, usually lasting 1 or 2 hours, was transcribed. Sometimes they needed to be translated into English. And in the end, we had thousands of pages of text that we put into this in vivo database. And we also had case write-ups that we analyzed, which included descriptions from our field notes and also our preliminary analyses. And these preliminary analyses were the patterns that we saw in the data. So when we were looking at the grounded theory, it's those initial patterns that you see in the data. And from that, we came up with 30-odd categories, things. And then we reduced these down after an initial pilot period of coding. We reduced these down to 12 or so. And I'll show you what the coding looks like. So there's the stats. We ended up having 15,000 or so coding references in all of our interviews, which was a lot of work. And then you could categorize something, a piece of text, an excerpt from a transcript as, for example, transformation of sociality or reskilling, which we did with the following quote, which I'll read to you. This is just a little excerpt, but I'll read the full text now. So this was an interview that one of our researchers did with a dairy farmer about how robotization was changing his work life. The interviewer begins, but I'm thinking that as a farmer, one's tasks also change markedly. And the farmer replies, yeah, they do. I mean, I spent a lot of the time before in the office keeping track of numbers and cows and are they pregnant, are they calving, and so on. Then I would go and check on them. Then I would go back and make notes, checking, noting, checking, noting. Yeah, so record, record, record. And the interviewer replies, so it's a lot more office and computer these days. And the farmer replies, yeah, I mean, at least for one man it is. I'm doing a lot more of that. And then we now have a joint WhatsApp conversation thread that all the employees use, where we write down observations. Then I receive those in the office. For example, information about calving, about udder infections, about which cows are in heat and who needs to be inseminated. Then I can type this information from WhatsApp into the system and have it sent directly to the system from, or you can have it sent directly to the system from another device, but that's expensive. WhatsApp is cheaper. And the interviewer says, that's awesome. It makes you think that's not exactly what the creators of WhatsApp intended. No, but WhatsApp is used a lot in trade and industry. So these are the kind of revelations that we get when we go out and talk with farmers and things that you maybe wouldn't expect. And it's the type of data that qualitative research can produce and the type of data that we think is lacking in robotics research. So that particular quote that you see up there was coded both for transformation of sociality and reskilling. And these analytical categories we could then pull out of NVivo and use in our analysis seminars, where we came up with the findings that you'll find in Perspectives in Robots, but also the findings that we use to produce our outreach tools, which Kathleen and Catherine will present, and also BuildBot, the game, which Maria will maybe discuss. So. Yes, I asked you in the beginning which words you associated with the work of the woman ironing and of the men taking a break from their construction work. So I'll ask Sebastian to put it up on the screen now. So not surprisingly, a hard, physical, hard work, repetitive, boring comes up, manual. And actually, these are exactly the words that come up when we speak to robot makers. But none of these words are very significant when we speak to affected stakeholders. They don't describe their work as hard. They describe their work in these words: pride, service, colleagues, care, wages, autonomy, respect, and skills. So no matter how menial or manual or boring or repetitive we thought the work would be from the onset, when you talk to workers, they find their work to be very meaningful. Whatever their work is, no matter how hard it is, they find meaning in their work. And we have a chapter on this called Meaningful Work in the Perspectives on Robots. But these values that we elicit from ethnographic fieldwork, they matter to robot makers because how robot makers are defining construction and cleaning work as tedious or menial or monotonous is very different from the experience of workers. And it matters to policymakers because policymakers often suggest universal basic income as a safeguard against robotization. But none of our participants, no matter what type of work they did, would give up working for a guaranteed basic income. Not the cleaner, not the construction worker, and neither the robot makers. And finally, this matters to the affected stakeholders because their voices are finally being heard, and we think this is the contribution that ethnography can bring to robotics. That's it.